So to begin the top 10 solo dungeon crawler list, we are going to start it off with Zombicide, Black Plague, and Green Horde. That's right, both of them actually. Both of these particular games are worth a slot on the top 10 list in my opinion. These are two of the very first dungeon crawler based games that I ever really got into in terms of solo play. And it actually wasn't these two particular iterations. However, I believe these are the best of what Zombicide has to offer currently. I started off with modern Zombicide the very first season and went from there. This Black Plague and Green Horde box, these are the closest thing you're going to get to the best version of Zombicide currently. Invader has landed on Kickstarter, of course, and so that could change things, and we know there's some rule tweaks in there as well to make the game better. But in this particular top 10 list, we're going to say Black Plague and Green Horde are sitting in the number 10 position. So what are the reasons why I like this game? Well, first off, we did a playthrough of this game actually on the channel. This is something that I play not only on camera as well as off camera. It has cooperative play, it has solo play, it has dice rolling. You can control as many heroes as you please, up to the limits of the scenario. It's a dice chucker. It's basically a beer and pretzels game at its finest. It's light on the rules, but can become a little bit tedious as more and more monsters are added in, especially if you have the Kickstarter content. I found that's where the game can get a little bit bloated. So if you actually purchase the game straight from retail, you're really not missing out on too much because you're getting the actual core experience with a lot less rules lookups for those off monsters, because every major monster or abomination that adds into the game or that you decide to put into the game is going to add additional rules you have to double check, and of course you have to be able to actually move that AI during that particular phase of the game. So when I did my playthrough, I actually crammed a ton of them in, but it had me going back and forth to reference them, at least until I got more familiar with them. But if you just stick with the retail copy, you'll be perfectly fine, as there's only a handful to deal with in terms of the rules, and the rules really are easy to understand, and it's very straightforward. Now, where Zombicide kind of gets its knocks from in terms of individuals that don't like it is, again, it's focused on zombies. So if you're not really into that theme, or that theme has worn thin with you, then this may be a game that you're going to want to avoid. For me, I still like to have a game in my collection that's based on zombies, and if you're talking about solo play, this is the game that belongs in your collection, in my opinion. Again, I really do enjoy whether it's modern or medieval. I haven't had a chance to play Invader yet because that particular Zombicide Kickstarter was very recent, so I'm sure that's going to be an exciting entry, but I'm actually quite pleased and happy with the medieval setting, and I think I'll be sticking with just that and by itself, and kind of probably resting it there, because I find when I have time alone to play a quick game of just dice chucking, killing monsters, and trying to see whether I can progress and survive through a scenario, this typically is the game that lands on the table when I'm looking for that. So as a solo dungeon crawler, I cannot recommend this one highly enough. Sitting in the number 9 spot of the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is Deep Madness by Dimension Games. This one we did a playthrough on the channel of, where I was basically in a deep sea mining facility. It's a very dark and claustrophobic deep sea mining site, and basically there is an uncovering of a sphere that's going in there that's dragging everyone nearby into basically endless madness, and you've got all these Cthulhu based monsters that are coming out of this particular area, and they're trying to basically devour and destroy everything around it, and you've been sent in to basically look into what's going on here, find out what is happening, and why there's no communication coming out of this particular facility anymore. Of course, it sounds like a nightmare just going into it, but it was a lot of fun. Now, first off with this, you might think this lines up very similar to Zombicide Black Plague, or just the Zombicide series in general, and in one instance I would say yes. In my opinion, this particular game, though, is a step in a more advanced version of Zombicide, is what I would say. And I say that in a really, really good way. This game basically takes what Zombicide has in terms of a static map that's placed down and gives you a map that becomes transitional. As you go throughout the gameplay, you're going to have sides of the tiles which are going to be lit up perfectly okay to start with, but as time goes on, those particular tiles are going to become devoured, spawn points are going to show up, and monsters are going to flood in, which is a really cool mechanic of flipping the tiles. So you can see there in the video that I've got tiles, some of them are lit with kind of a yellow hue, and others are in red where they're devoured. So these tiles are basically not only modular for each scenario, similar to a Zombicide when you first set it up, but the tiles themselves then start flipping based on the game mechanics of the devouring system, and this all ties into what's called a devour track in this game, which is a really unique and cool way of building a timer essentially into each scenario where different things will trigger in different phases for every scenario that you're playing. So you're not always following the exact same set of parameters for particular sessions of the same game. So for instance, if you're playing scenario number 1, you'll have a set of objectives, you'll have a devour track that's set up and laid out in front of you with different events that will occur along that devour track through the phases. If you play through the second scenario, that is going to change. So it's not simply just here's an objective, get to that objective, flip the token over, and if it's what you want, you've won. That to me is where Zombicide keeps things very simplistic and kind of goes down that road of either picking up an objective, bringing it back, or maybe just revealing the correct objectives, that type of thing, or getting out of an exit. So it keeps it simplistic, but this one takes it to a more advanced level where you're not just worrying about getting to that token or finding that thing. There's other mechanics going on as well. So I'll explain that for those of you that haven't seen this particular playthrough that I did. But this playthrough that I did was in the deep sea mining facility itself. Basically, there was a shuttle that needed to come to pick us up in order to move us on to the next part of the scenario. That's another really cool thing about the game, is that it runs through a campaign that actually connects throughout the different scenarios. But it was supposed to come, but we didn't have the power necessary to get the shuttle to our particular location. So we needed to find a way to get some power. So it forced us to go through these 3 different options of doors into lower sections of the deep sea mining facility, which led to 3 different areas that were totally separate and remote from each other, which had different colored objectives sitting in stacks 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. And those stacks were in each of those 3 different locations. They were all color coded differently as well. So a green stack, yellow stack, red stack. Depending on where we went and grabbed those particular energy tokens, they would have a number on them. And we could actually choose which ones we go to because we knew not only the number value that was sitting on the top of the stack, we knew the color. And the reason the color mattered was because once we got up to, I believe it was 12 total energy, in other words, 12 objective tokens in total value collected, we basically got enough power to get the shuttle working again, to get it to park next to us so we could get out of there. And what's really cool about that is it opens up a whole bunch of strategy where those 3 color-coded objectives were actually tied to 3 different locations around the deep sea mining facility, the level we were currently on, as to where the shuttle would actually show up. So it's not just a generic, oh, the shuttle's going to show up here and this is what happens if you grab this token. No, it's actually based on where you grab your tokens and the monsters that are trying to hinder your ability to get there. The gameplay's changing in multiple different ways. I was really, really impressed with this one. It shocked me, and it was definitely one of the games in 2018 that kind of blew me away for a dungeon crawler that I was not expecting. It has adventure, fighting, horror, miniatures. It's based in science fiction. It has action point allowance, cooperative play, dice rolling, hand management as well, modular boards, all that kind of stuff. It was a really, really fun experience, and I highly recommend people looking for a science fiction based or themed, Cthulhu themed game to check Deep Madness out. Highly recommended. Coming in at number 8 is Fireteam Zero from Emergent Games. And now this one is really cool for a number of different reasons. And honestly, this particular position in the top 10 list could easily have been swapped potentially with Deep Madness. These two in my opinion, are very much in close proximity to each other as to which one I would choose to play on a given night solo. These ones both have different reasons why I enjoy them. One of the biggest ties into Fireteam Zero that pulled me in the most was the story. Now, there is definitely, and there is still tons of story and deep madness within the rulebook, as well as the art book and everything else they have for it. But what Fireteam Zero brought to the table that was truly something that sucked me in even further than deep madness was novels. There are actually written novels which you can actually get digitally, or I'm not 100% certain if you can actually get the paperback volumes of them, but the digital ones are up on Amazon, and there's 2 different books. Now, currently, I've only read through one of them fully, but after reading through that book, it totally sucked me into what was actually happening in this particular game, as well as actually connecting me to the characters that I was playing. So those particular miniatures on the table were not just another random soldier with a random name that I didn't actually understand any backstory to. This book filled in a whole bunch of where that character was modern day. So those books were basically, or at least one of the ones I actually read, was based in current times, whereas Fireteam Zero is based in 1942, when 4 soldiers vanished from basically a training program of a newly formed 1st Ranger Battalion. Their names were stricken from the roster and stuff like this, and they were chosen because they had like unique skills, and they would fight in secret against terrifying monsters. And this is basically their whole story. That's essentially the entry into this kind of story. And I could go on and on and on about it, because I read that book, and that book was just so cool in taking what this game is all about, which is showing you what happened back in 1942 with these soldiers and what they had to go through and the things that happened and the obstacles they had to overcome in order to get where they were. And then I read that book, and it actually kind of gave you an idea as to how this individual was doing later in life, and how the problem had changed from back in the game's timeline to the book's timeline, which is just, it's really, really cool. Now, I don't know what the other book does. I don't know if it actually is prior to the actual board game, or if it happens to be after the second, or after the book that I read. I'd have to double check that. But I can tell you that having a book to read to a game is something that is rare, and certainly pulls you in a little bit more. Now, the gameplay and mechanics in this one are also extremely fun and very different than things like Zombicide. It's all about hand management in this one, really. You're going to be building your own deck pool. You're going to be using cards and dice rolling. So there is randomness involved, but cards will actually state what you can do. And those cards are drawn from your deck of cards. Your deck of cards are basically specific to a type of soldier that you are. So you can either be like the leader, or maybe you're the demolition man, that type of thing. And there is a plethora of characters you can choose from, whether they're male, female. They've got everything covered. It's actually really, really fun. And one of the coolest parts about this one that I enjoyed too is they have fully voiced over introduction. You might have noticed there in the video that I pulled out a CD at one point. That CD actually houses all of the audio for the initial run-throughs of every single scenario within the base game, which I think is just so cool to actually feel like you're having an actual, talk before you actually move into, or like a general's basically giving you orders before you head out type thing, and it's giving you a story, it's setting you up, it kind of sets the mood for what's actually happening. I just really, really enjoyed my time with this. I also did a playthrough on the channel if you're interested in checking it out. I could talk a lot more about this, but I'm trying to keep this video concise as much as possible. But this one is great, and I can definitely help you out. If you check out that video, you'll be able to see a lot more of the details of how it plays. This is easily in my top 10 at number 8. Coming in at number 7 on the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is Imperial Assault. And this one is published by Fantasy Flight Games. This one is awesome. Now, first off, I need to mention the fact that Descent absolutely gets a nod here, because Descent is what Imperial Assault's app essentially is based on. And the solo play, or the availability to play Star Wars Imperial Assault solo, strictly and honestly needs to nod to Descent, because that's where this app integration really came from and is building upon. So the reason why I have Imperial Assault over top of Descent and actually don't have Descent on this list is not because necessarily Descent doesn't deserve to be on the list, but in my opinion, this one is the one for me that works at number 7. So for you, this could be different. You may enjoy Descent more than you enjoy the Star Wars theme, and just for that alone, that could swap these two in and out at this particular position, or maybe a different position. But for me, Star Wars Imperial Assault is a solid 7. Currently, the app has a tutorial campaign, which is actually quite long and decent. I did a full playthrough on my channel of that. We actually used the app as we went through the gameplay. I found that a lot of fun because I was able to bounce between the app and showing you guys how the app actually will control the AI of the game and actually play through the game at the same time. We actually did this, if I remember correctly, on the hardest difficulty, which made it even more insane, and we had a blast with it. I remember this being a lot of fun, and the game itself is going to stay in my collection. It's not going anywhere. I literally own absolutely everything for Star Wars Imperial Assault. Of course, I like Star Wars, but I don't buy every Star Wars product that comes out. I don't have X-Wing, I don't have Armada, I don't have Rebellion. I found Star Wars Imperial Assault to be the one that was a perfect catch-all to cover everything I needed in one Star Wars package. And when they implemented the solo play in the app, I was automatically sold. So the other thing that's really cool about this is there is and has been support past the launch of the app. The app currently has one full campaign that came out when the app was originally delivered, and recently, within the last, well, I shouldn't say too recently, it's been a bit, but a Jabba the Hutt based scenario or campaign had come out as well to bring campaign play for solo for that as well. So at this point in time now is probably a good time to start diving into the solo play for Imperial Assault. Now I'm still waiting to see how much support will be there for Imperial Assault solo using the app as we go along. Will these campaigns that get released be a once every 6 months thing, a once every year thing? Is there a particular schedule they're going off of? And also, I am very interested to see kind of what's going to happen as time goes on and how quick those updates are going to come up. But in terms of picking something, Star Wars Imperial Assault works for me. If you're interested in the fantasy side of things and you want to go down the Descent road, the Descent has an app integration which has a ton of content, probably about I shouldn't say 4 times, it's probably 8 to 10 times more content in the app than Star Wars does. So if you want to go that route, there's nothing wrong with that either. It really just comes down to which theme you prefer. So again, Star Wars Imperial Assault is my number 7. At number 6 of the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers, we have Sword and Sorcery. This is from Arius Games. This one is something special. Now, this is literally the epitome of an epic fantasy, cooperative, and solo playable board game. This thing is a narrative journey as well as a dungeon crawler. It is one of the most perfect blends of the two, to be honest, and also has really cool scaling with the different miniatures that come in this particular game, as they're all color coded from the get-go. So you basically don't even have to paint anything if you don't want to. You have different levels of difficulty based on the different colors that will come out. There's a progressing story based on the choices that you make with your heroes as you go through your journey. The story progresses, and I won't go ahead and spoil anything further, but if you do want to check out the playthrough I have, you can see an example of one of the scenarios where we actually played through on the channel. We had a ton of fun with this one. You'll be able to see kind of how the story unravels as you hit particular spots during the scenario. So this one, like Zombicide, only in the fact that the scenario you're playing is fixed. In other words, the tiles that are laid down are revealed from the start, except it's got that fog of war approach in terms of you don't know what's further on down the game board except for what's revealed from the start of the scenario. And then as you move through the different corridors, things will reveal themselves as the story kind of goes forward. But it's not kind of a deep madness situation where the tiles are going to flip and things like that. But this game definitely has some very, very interesting story-driven narrative mechanics built into it. It allows for a lot of adventure, fantasy. It's action point allowance. It has area movement, cooperative play. It's got dice chucking in there as well. Modular boards, variable player powers. You have the ability to upgrade your character. There's a really cool ability in this game that helps you out when you die, where if you die, you actually can go into a ghost or spirit form and still be just as useful to your friends or allies that you're using in order to try to defeat enemies. So you can actually see here in the video that I've got what looks to be a hero standing, and two of my heroes are in ghost form. So basically they are essentially gone and they're out of their physical form and into a spirit form, and at this particular time they're able to still manipulate the battlefield as they go through it in a different capacity, which is a really cool way of mitigating the whole death thing in terms of you dying. And there are ways using soul gems in this game to eventually get your character to revive himself and come back. So there are ways to kind of come back out of that state. It's very, very much a perfect blend of mixing an MMORPG, so something very familiar to most of us like World of Warcraft would be a very good comparison to this one in terms of its feel. If you had any kind of liking to the way that World of Warcraft felt and looked, this game is going to be the closest representation of that on the table, besides the actual World of Warcraft, the board game from way back. But the actual gameplay and the narrative is totally different, and it was not a knockoff of World of Warcraft, but it sure feels like it has that vibe. And for me, it actually helped. It actually helped me get into it further. So highly recommend you check this one out. Again, heavy fantasy theme, so if you're interested in this one, there is a game out there that they have, Galaxy Defenders, which is a sci-fi version, but I believe strongly that Sword and Sorcery is the much better iteration of their epic fantasy cooperative board game experience. So this sits at a very solid number 6. Sitting in the 5 spot on the top 10 solo dungeon crawler list is Folklore the Affliction. This one is published by Greenbrier Games, and I'm really excited to talk about this one because we haven't done a playthrough of this one on the channel yet. I know, and I've probably said back when we unboxed this thing about a year ago, at least the core box, that I was going to do that. And the reason I've held off is because they had a recent Kickstarter, which really isn't recent anymore, but has just delivered on all the extra content. And some of that content enhances the look of the game. It enhances some of the maps. It adds extra cards. It adds extra miniatures. And it just flushes out an already really interesting game. Now, what I also want to mention before I go any further with talking about Folklore the Affliction is I want to talk about this top 5. So the top 5 section of this list, I want you guys to note the fact that every single one of these games, starting with this one and going up to the very first pick, are very, very narrative driven. And there's a reason why I gravitate towards those personally over any other dungeon crawlers. The dungeon crawlers that I had prior to this did a great job of that, but to a certain extent. These top 5, in my opinion, are the ones that push that to the next level. They take you to a spot where you actually truly want to get the game back to the table to see what happens next. Not only to progress a really great story, but also to potentially progress a really cool character that you have, or at least to see how a particular group of characters will pan out over time in a expanding kind of campaign setting. So Folklore the Affliction, the reason why I've chosen this one at the 5 spot is because it's an expandable ongoing horror RPG. It's got immersive storyline going through the whole thing. It's heavy narrative, huge. It has combat involved. It has some dice rolling in there. So again, if you're not a fan of dice rolling in general to resolve some type of combats, then maybe this one may not be for you. But I can tell you right now, the narrative drive in this particular game is possibly one of the strongest, if not the strongest, of this entire list. Now, I don't know for sure if that's 100% accurate yet because I haven't finished Folklore the Affliction. So I wouldn't want to say that it's the most narrative driven of all these games that I have, but it's up there. It takes the whole narrative to another level, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoy the game so much. Again, I've only experienced the core game off camera so far in my own time. I cannot wait to do an actual playthrough on the channel with you guys and show you at least a bit of what this game has to offer. There is dice rolling, as I mentioned. There's grid movement. There's modular boards. They use basically paper thin. The best way to describe it is, instead of using like cardboard modular tiles to create the game world, they're using these really thin, high quality glossed pieces of paper. Basically, they're not paper, but they're actually like a step up from that. Almost like a light lamination is what it feels like, but it really isn't. I don't really know how to describe it exactly, but essentially very thin. So they can stuff in a whole bunch of different tiles into this game to have you traversing into all kinds of different scenarios and running into all kinds of different people. So I'm really excited to show you guys more about this on the channel, and my goal in 2019 is to try to get this one into a playthrough to show you more. But this one sits as a solid number 5. And now at the number 4 position of the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is Shadows of Brimstone. Now this one truly has a special place in my heart, because this was truly the very first dungeon crawler that I ever played solo. And I also have played this one with a group of friends as well. And no matter how you play this game, it is utterly amazing if you truly get into it. So one of the biggest barrier to entry for people that are trying to get into Shadows of Brimstone is the insane amount of content. As you can see here, I've got drawers upon drawers of stuff that I've organized, things that friends have 3D printed out for me to hold tokens, all kinds of. I've gone to the nines with this game, and I've had it for years, and I've also been a big supporter of their Kickstarters, regardless of the fact that some of the Kickstarters do take quite a while to fulfill. When the game hits the table, the creators of this game truly love gaming and storytelling. And this game literally is one of the best dice chucking RPG systems that you could possibly ask for out there on the market right now. If you want to go, head over heels and spend a ton of money in order to get a whole vast accumulation of environments and enemies, you can do that. And the game just makes for a really easy way to integrate all of those particular differences between environments and enemies into one giant bucket. And they use cards to basically have you traversing through mines, which then can potentially take you through portals, which can then take you to other worlds. And that's why the game can continue expanding, because it's set in the Wild West, but these mines have what's called Darkstone, which everyone in the land essentially is trying to go after. And Darkstone is really valuable, but it also has really bad side effects. It can mutate you and cause you to gain a third arm, and your character can hold a third gun and things like this. But it can also kill you. The crazy thing is when you go into these mines, you have no idea what you're going to run into, except in most cases, there are tons of different scenarios throughout most of the different game booklets for the expansions and the core games that will also kind of lead you into pre-built scenarios, but they're not pre-built. And this is where the magic of Shadows of Brimstone really comes through. It essentially is it's a toolkit, or a sandbox is the best way to say it. And what you're seeing on screen right now is a lot of stuff that looks very customized. And that's because that is based in what's called Hexcrawl, which is a fantastic community-driven, and actually was created by one individual. I believe his name was Sid, if I'm not mistaking his name. I could be messing up his name there, but on Board Game Geek, I believe his name is Sid. And he put a phenomenal amount of work into this thing called Hexcrawl, and you can download the PDF free of charge and literally have access to a campaign system that has you going across this whole western landscape, basically trying to stop all of these monsters from coming out of these mines and terrorizing the cities in this western land. But as you can see here as we go along, these tiles are in the game, and the way it's set up is so cool for one major reason. There's no fog of war. It's not like Zombicide where the 9 tiles are on the table and you know the monsters are going to land in there, and it's just a matter of figuring out where you're going to hide and where you're going to run. Shadows of Brimstone has this, reveal as you move mechanic, which is just so much fun. And there's nothing like the feeling of it when you start doing it. But basically, you literally start the game with a single tile, the mine entrance. You walk in with your party, and it looks like just like the tiles I'm showing you here, and you move right into the gameplay. You walk past the first tile to the edge, and you explore on. You have no idea what you're going to run into. You flip a card, the card tells you which tile to then put down, and you start building out a mine. So the mine is completely random based on the number or how much content you have for the game, and it only gets more and more insane as you add more and more content in. On the flip side of the mine side, so you have the mine side on one side, which is kind of like you're traversing through this mine, but on the opposite side, you have other worlds, which are things like Caverns of Sindar, or potentially swamps, or Tradera, which are all these expansions which take you to different settings. Like you could be whisked off to World War II, or end up in a swamp, or end up in, now we have Forbidden Fortress is a new Kickstarter that recently just launched. Now you can end up, in feudal Japan. And it's like, so you could literally be in the wild, like the setting is the Wild West, which again is a very underutilized setting in board games, which is one of the reasons why I love this game so much, because there's not many games taking advantage of the Western theme. But it also mixes in the Cthulhu horror in there as well. Plus it's got that RPG feel to it, where it's like you take your character, you're actually using you're actually using a book in order to upgrade your character. You have skill trees. It's so much fun. As you can see here, like I have a ton of stuff for this game, and I'm in the middle of painting it still and assembling it. But that's one of the other things I want to mention, is one of the biggest barriers to entry that I didn't actually say earlier on in this large pile of words, is that a lot of people are scared away of the two core games, which is these the two core sets essentially typically require a little bit of work. So there is some work involved in getting those two core sets created. Once you get those created, though, the expansions that come after it are much easier, and they've gotten better and better at making the assembly process less painful. But again, it's the gameplay that's really important here, not necessarily the miniatures, and that's something I really wanted to let you guys know about. So again, Shadows of Brimstone, one of my all-time favorites. I will never sell this game, and it sits solidly at number 4. Coming in at number 3 on the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is Kingdom Death Monster. Now this thing came out in 2015, and it was designed by Adam Poots, and of course published by Kingdom Death itself, which is just basically under the umbrella of Adam Poots. This is a fully cooperative tabletop hobby gaming experience. That's the best way to say it. This is like the all-in Grail game. This is one of those games that comes around every once in a while that is a game that most solo players are going to find and want to know more about. And my aim on the channel is going to be at some point introducing you to the beginning of Kingdom Death Monster and what it has for you. I have been assembling miniatures for a while. I've been tinkering around with the beginning years of the campaign. The game is basically set with a crazy campaign system that has you awakening in this extremely dark landscape that has a very mature theme. So first off, if you're not into a mature or adult themed game, this is one you're going to want to steer clear of. But if you are okay with that, then I think the gameplay, as well as what's happening storytelling wise here, is going to really, really grab you. Again, this particular game sits in the top 5, as I mentioned, even starting with Folklore the Affliction. Every game from Folklore and Affliction above has such a massive narrative pull that you want to come back to find out what happens to your settlement here in Kingdom Death. You want to find out what happens to your character, but the game is vicious, and you will lose your character. Your characters will die, your settlement will get crushed, and you're going to have to basically be okay with resetting and moving forward and trying something different. That's where this game is essentially the best comparison I can make for this one is Dark Souls. That is literally what this game feels like. You're going into what is basically a very bleak an unlikely situation for you to succeed, and you're trying to see how far you can go. And it honestly becomes a personal challenge, and it's one of the funnest personal challenges ever, especially when you're playing solo, because you truly get to decide on every aspect of the campaign as you move through it. The decisions that you make impact your settlement as you move through. The game has multiple phases. As I mentioned, the settlement phase is probably the coolest phase of the entire game, besides maybe the giant actual monster showdowns that happen, which are also extremely cool. But again, if you're looking for a game that has some dice rolling, it does, but it's not as heavy as something like Shadows of Brimstone and dice rolling. It does have tables that you roll on in order to resolve things similar to Shadows of Brimstone, but maybe not as aggressive and as often. There is going to be some bookkeeping here. It's a role-playing game. It's expecting you to do some role-playing as you play through it. There's grid movement. It has a massive board for the showdowns with the big monsters as you run into them. It has a hunt board that basically you got to move through this hunt track to kind of see whether or not you can hunt down a particular monster. If you destroy it, you can harvest its components inside of it, basically, or pieces of its actual carcass to use in order to build more armor, because essentially you show up when you awaken in this blackness naked. You literally have nothing, and you go from nothing. So I've been currently sleeving this thing, organizing it, getting used to the beginning Lantern years, because it's a behemoth of a game, and also building miniatures. But this is something that's on my radar in 2019 to show you guys, and definitely sits in the top 3, or I should say definitely sits in the 3rd position on this top 10 list. Sitting at the number 2 spot of the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is Mansions of Madness from Fantasy Flight Games. This game is pure masterpiece. If you are into the Cthulhu theme or the H.P. Lovecraft world in general, you are going to love Mansions of Madness. And even if you're not, out of all of the games, solo play wise, to best introduce you to that particular theme, I would choose Mansions of Madness. I would choose this over Arkham Horror the LCG, although of course we're talking dungeon crawlers in this top 10. But if you were talking with trying to get somebody into what it feels like to play a game that's in the Cthulhu realm or the H.P. Lovecraft realm of content, this is the best game you can possibly introduce somebody with. And if you're trying to play a game solo, which is the reason why it is number 2 on this list for solo dungeon crawlers, it is by far one of the most immersive experiences you're going to get in a board game due to how absolutely amazingly well done the app is. It's phenomenal. The only thing lacking in the app that could elevate this game to almost heights that could not be reached by anything else I can think of off the top of my head would be full voice acting throughout the app. If they were able to actually allow somehow the availability for maybe not everything to be fully voice acted, but maybe some of the major, statements that are made throughout the game sometimes you're walking through it. I find the only detraction from this game is that it really comes down to how much the player or the solo player is getting into the game. If you're reading the story out loud and you're getting into it, this is an experience like nothing else. You're going to be again, with most of these dungeon crawlers, you're going to be chucking dice. So dice is going to be involved in most of them. And that's kind of something that's been around for a long time. A lot of dungeon crawlers in general have dice involved, but we're seeing some new games pop out here and there that are starting to have cards integrated into dungeon crawlers. So again, if you're adverse to dice, yes, there's dice in here. Is there randomness? Yes. Is there mitigation for that randomness? Yes. There are things like clues and things like that. But the whole Cthulhu thing is meant to kind of mess with you a little bit. You're supposed to basically take a little bit of a beating. So the odds are stacked against you in most scenarios as you try to fight your way through a story that unveils itself through an app. So you are looking on screen right now and seeing me actually going through a playthrough that I did way earlier on when the channel was much newer, and I basically did this through my phone. Now, at this particular time, I wasn't filming it as well as I would do now, but it's a decent representation of how Mansions of Madness flows and how it works, and truly is one of the first games literally every single time that comes off the shelf when I'm introducing somebody who's never played a board game before. This is the game that I usually typically give them to play, because you can take the horror theme in this one and kind of strip it away. It's not really that heavy. The real excitement comes from the evolving mansion that you're essentially going through, the evolving story that you're opening up, and the care to find out how that story ends. Now, in this one, your character may not be as strong of a narrative grab for you because your character may end up going insane or may die, and you kind of know it's a one-shot scenario. You don't play a campaign mode in this where you play a scenario and move to the next one. It's strictly a one-off. The reason it's in my top 5 is because the narrative is so strong. The story, the actual objective that you're trying to complete in order to win the scenario is what drives you and what really hooks you into the feeling of the game itself. Plus, again, the fact that the app does a fantastic job of dragging you in with immersive music. It has the all of the flavor text added into the app that you can read out as you go along. The story flushes out, and the game throws in enough surprises as you move through that it's things are unexpected, things change. And another really cool aspect about the app that I really truly appreciate is the fact that as you add more content into Mansions of Madness through expansions, you're not just adding an extra scenario or two, you're also adding more tiles into the app that are going to randomize the previous, or add, sometimes they're going to actually implement or change some of the layouts that you can potentially run into by replaying another scenario. So say for instance you have the core box and you have a set of tiles, so say 1 to 10. If you go buy another expansion for it and that comes with 5 more tiles, now you have 15 tiles, and you tell the app that you have that other expansion. The app then will start pulling tiles from that other expansion and building out alternate scenarios for a similar scenario you've already played. So you can replay the same scenario even though you're driving through a narrative that's essentially, you may know what the objective is in the end to win, but the actual mansion may change, the items may move, the things. So in other words, there's one of these scenarios called Innsmouth, which is one of the most notoriously vicious scenarios out there for Mansions of Madness, and that one changes quite a bit based on some of the tiles that get implemented into the game. But I could go on about this one forever. I absolutely love it as a solo game and highly recommend it. It sits at a number 2 spot for me. And the number 1 game for the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers is none other than Gloom Haven. That's right, this behemoth of a game still sits on the top of my top 10 solo dungeon crawler list. However, this is the first time I've actually done a dungeon crawler specific list, but Gloom Haven does still take the cake here as the most fully complete package for the lowest price. Now, first off, Gloom Haven is not a low priced product, but the amount of content and the world that it allows you to explore, the synergies between how the cards work as well as how you explore through the game and create your character and build that character over time, how the land is shifting and changing based on your scenarios that you're playing, and the story that it unfolds as it goes through is spectacular. And if you haven't checked out my playthrough on the channel, I have over 115 to 120 videos worth of Gloomhaven. We also did a Kickstarter campaign where we played through all of the Kickstarter release scenarios as the second print went through, I believe, because I was part of the very first Kickstarter, which is why I had my copy during the second print. And I was very excited to be able to play through that with the community. It was a lot of fun, a lot of unique scenarios that we played through. Honestly, one of the biggest things about this game, if you're not familiar with it, is the hand management of your character. It's very different than the majority of the dungeon crawlers out there. Now, it's not that card-driven dungeon crawlers hadn't been done prior to Gloomhaven, but they hadn't been done this well. And the synergy of how you actually use the cards in your hand, whether you're using the top of one card and the bottom of the other when you play your 2 cards, how you're going to use your hand and how you're going to manage that hand based on what is lost and what is in the discard pile is your life of your character. And that's such a cool mechanic where you're constantly having to do hand management. Honestly, that is the strongest mechanic in the game that I love the most, and what really sets it apart from every other dungeon crawler on this list, where dice is the heavy mechanic, because typically in the dungeon crawler realm, dice come with almost 80% of those particular types of games. So when you get into the cards, it opens up so many different possibilities for development, because you're going down a road of a card can be created to say and do many different things, whereas a die can only be customized to a certain extent, unless you want to roll like a D100 with a bajillion options on it, but then the randomness creeps in to the utmost extent. So at the end of the day, for a overall arching campaign feel, this is the game for you. If you're looking for something where you can pick it up, play it true solo with one character, or even multi-handed with additional characters, you literally go through a map that unlocks different locations as you successfully defeat particular scenarios, and you progress through this story that is literally going to take you at least 100 hours, if not more, to complete one full playthrough through. And the coolest part is, there is a new expansion which is literally coming down the pipes to retail within the next month, called Forgotten Circles. So if you've already completed the campaign for Gloom Haven and you're just dying for more is coming, and that'll expand the game even further. So easily the top and number one of my top 10 solo dungeon crawler list is Gloom Haven. So that wraps up the top 10 solo dungeon crawlers. I have one thing to ask from you guys, and I want to know from you, what are your top 10 solo dungeon crawlers? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure the community here would love to compare lists, take a look at all the different entries. We all may learn different items or products from each other, which would be really, really cool. First off, I want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas, and thank you so much for watching, and as always, keep on rolling solo.